Hello, I am Kunchumohan Vadakan. I study the nervous system to understand how it operates. I have a conflict of interest to declare. In this presentation, we will examine a possible mechanism for consciousness with the idea that if any possible mechanism can explain all the features of consciousness at various levels, then there is a possibility that that mechanism is correct. Consciousness is a first-person inner sensation to which only the owner of the nervous system has access, and the subject can internally sense the feeling of being conscious. For a third-person observer, the surrogate motor actions such as speech and behavior provides an indication about the first-person inner sensation of consciousness in a subject. Now, how to understand consciousness? There is a general consensus that brain processes are responsible for consciousness. We have to explore and find out whether there is anything within the system that can generate inner sensations. And we have to examine the background state of the system that can generate the state of inner sensation of consciousness. And that can also provide sufficient surrogate motor activities such as speech and behavior that allows a third-person examiner to assess the consciousness in a subject. Now, the truth is that since consciousness is a first-person inner sensation, what we can do is to develop a framework, a theoretical framework for consciousness that can explain all its features. Once we have that framework in hand, we should be able to replicate that mechanism in an engineered system. That will provide proof for the mechanism, because we cannot go and examine the first person inner sensation in a subject. So biological experimentations cannot provide a definitive proof. Now let us examine all the features of consciousness observed at various levels that we need to explain using a basic mechanism that generates inner sensations within the system. So let us make a list of it. There are several general features. Consciousness is a first-person inner sensation towards which only the owner of the nervous system has access. Consciousness has a sensory qualia to it. We have to explain a framework for generation of sensory qualia. Now we have to explain sensory qualia to percepts during perception. I will be explaining that in a separate presentation. Large number of studies have shown that the ability to memorize is associated with consciousness. So how a correlation is existing there, because memory itself is a first-person inner sensation. Now, as I mentioned before, to a third-person observer, the indication of a subject's consciousness is based on surrogate motor actions. So we need to provide an explanation how the inner sensation of being conscious is related with the surrogate behavioral markers of. Now, some of the behavioral actions can take place in a subconscious state. So we need to provide an explanation for that. Motor actions at subconscious state. Now, the organization of the nervous system among the members of a species have similarities. Therefore, it is expected that the consciousness among the members of a species should have similar qualities. Now, each member of a species would have exposed to specific experiences, and those experiences are specific associative learning events. Therefore, we need to provide an explanation why there is subjective qualities to consciousness. Now we have to explain certain biological findings. It is found that the state of being conscious is maintained only during certain ranges of frequencies of oscillating extracellular potentials. If we put two electrodes into the extracellular matrix space and we measure the difference in the potentials, we will see an oscillating nature to that difference. and normal level of consciousness is maintained only during a specific range of frequencies of those potentials. So therefore we need to provide an explanation for that. So we need to provide an explanation why the consciousness is seen at a particular frequency. Frequency means the rate of that oscillation per second. Now we need to explain why there is a state of sleep. During 24 hours, humans have to sleep during 1/3 of that time. That means 1/3 of the operation of the system need to change its level of consciousness in order for that system to maintain consciousness during the rest 2/3 of its time. We know that anesthetics and the states of encephalitis is inflammation of the brain tissue. So during these two conditions, consciousness is altered. So why in these two conditions there is loss of consciousness? We have to also provide explanations for redundancy. That means after surgical removal of a large portion of the cortex, the patient remains conscious, and the level of consciousness, even subjective as well as third person observed features indicating consciousness, does not alter. So that indicates that whatever mechanism we are going to explain should have some redundant features that can explain why consciousness is not altered after surgical removal of a portion of the cortex. The next one is we need to provide an explanation why consciousness is a graded phenomenon and not an all or none phenomenon. Now we have to ask certain important questions that are required for generating a framework for consciousness. The first question is why there is inner sensations within the nervous system. Why inner sensations? So this is very unique to the nervous system and it is not seen in any other system, and we have difficulties to approach towards these inner sensations. That first person property is what makes nervous system unique, and that is the difficulty for us to understand what it is. So we have to ask a philosophical question why there is inner sensations to begin with. So we will discuss that, and then we have to ask the question that what is there in a background state that can generate a baseline consciousness? What is there in the background state? And thirdly, we should ask the question, what is the benefit of having this state of consciousness? What is the advantage that the system is getting by being conscious? In other words, how consciousness has evolved over time. This is important because if we are trying to replicate it in an engineered system, by making that system conscious, what is the mechanical advantage that the system is having by being conscious? So first let us examine why there are inner sensations. We know there are two types of living things on earth, plants and the other one are animals. Now compared to plants, animals have the ability to move distances, and during natural selection the fittest survived. So why inner sensations are present in the nervous systems of animals? In other words, what is the benefit of having inner sensations? What might have generated these inner sensations? We can bring an explanation to that as follows. If an item is very close to an animal, that means an item is very close to the nervous system of that animal. And if that animal has different sensory systems, it is expected that different sensory features from that item will arrive towards the different sensory systems of that animal. And if these different sensory features can be associated within the nervous system of that animal, then that may provide certain benefits to that nervous system, because we know that different sensory systems have different features. For example, we know that there are vision, and light is the stimulus that moves very fast, 3 multiplied by 10 to the power of 8 meters per second. When the item moves far away from the nervous system, the light can arrive at the nervous system much faster than all the remaining sensory features, such as hearing, the sound, which has low velocity, that is 3 multiplied by 10 to the power of 2 meters per second, and then smell comes through molecules and maybe it has only 3 meters per second velocity. Touch by direct contact and it has very low velocity, and the taste, that is through molecules, that also has very low velocity of arriving. When the item is far away from the animal, the very sight of the item can provide inner sensation of the remaining features if the nervous system had associated those features while the item was close to that nervous system. In other words, if the item is close to the nervous system and if the nervous system can associate all the sensory features that are arriving from that item, and the mechanism that associate all those features can be reactivated by the arrival of one of the sensory stimulus from that item when the item is far away from the animal, then that will provide survival advantage to that animal. In a predator-prey environment, this is very important. I need not have to explain to you about it. Now, light travels in straight lines. What if the item is hiding on a crack or a crevice? In that case, it will be the hearing or the smell that arrives the nervous system first. So, the fast arriving or the first arriving sensory stimuli that provides inner sensations of the remaining features from that item will provide survival advantage to that nervous system. And we can think that natural selection would have occurred to those nervous systems where the ability to generate inner sensation was robust. So, inner sensations provides the nervous system survival advantage, and all the nervous systems that we see these days has that ability. Now, the question is, how can the arrival of two sensory stimuli towards a nervous system when the item is close to that nervous system, how that arrival makes an association within the nervous system, so that at a later time when one of the sensory stimuli arrives to the nervous system can induce inner sensation of the second sensory stimulus. That is the crucial question we need to ask, and we have to find out where such associative changes can occur within the nervous system and how the arrival of one of the sensory stimuli at a later period of time can induce units of inner sensations. Is there anything in the nervous system that can provide these two features? We have to go and explore the nervous system to find out if anything is present. We can make a feasible hypothesis, and once we have a hypothesis in hand, we can then examine the background state of the system that generate the inner sense of consciousness. And we have to ask the question that how can the system be more efficient to operate? Is a background state of consciousness going to provide benefit to the nervous system? How it is being generated? Or we can ask the question whether a system that can generate inner sensations will eventually develop a background state of consciousness. So we will look into that when we derive the mechanism for generation of inner sensations. So first let us see what's going to happen when the item is very close to the nervous system. Item close to the nervous system. Item is far away from the nervous system. So we have to go and see what's there within the nervous system that can make an association. In consciousness studies, this association is called binding. Consciousness itself is viewed as a large binding process. So let us see what that binding is. How can two sensory stimuli be associated that will allow the induction of inner sensations of the second stimulus when only the first stimulus arrives at the nervous system. I have explained these in separate presentations that you can watch. Here I will summarize the hypothesized mechanism. So let us imagine that there is a sensory stimulus S1 that arrives at the presynaptic terminal, and this is a synapse, so this will be a postsynaptic terminal, or it is otherwise called spine. It is also called dendritic spine, and the activity propagates towards the neuron of this postsynaptic terminal. And this is the second stimulus, that is S2, that is a presynaptic terminal, its postsynaptic terminal, and then it propagates towards this neuron N2. Let us also imagine that these neurons are connected to motor units, either immediately or after few neuronal orders. They are connected to motor units. Based on semblance hypothesis, the associative learning will induce certain changes at the locations of convergence of these two sensory stimuli. That means after propagating through different orders of neurons, at the locations of convergence, there should be some changes taking place. The ideal location for that associative learning induced change to take place is hypothesized to occur between the postsynaptic terminals. So during associative learning, an inter-postsynaptic functional link is getting generated. There are different mechanisms for the induction of inter-postsynaptic functional link. Now we have to ask the question, why such a change should take place between the postsynaptic terminals and not anywhere else? I have explained these in separate presentations. Now we will also briefly mention it in the next stage. Now comes the important part. At a later time, when one of the stimuli S1 arrives to the system having this interpostsynaptic functional link, can it induce inner sensations of S2? That's the key question. Is there any characteristic features present at this location that can induce units of inner sensation? So here comes the sensory stimulus S1 to its postsynaptic terminal that is connected to its neuron N1. Now the question is there anything unique here at these locations that can generate units of inner sensations of S2? Now if we look at the background state of the synapses, we can see that there is quantum release of neurotransmitter molecules taking place all the time from the presynaptic terminal to the synaptic cleft, and those molecules will bind to the postsynaptic membrane and depolarize a portion of this dendritic spine head. That's happening all the time. So if you can represent that quantum release causing these small depolarizations, we can plot it like this. That is taking place all the time, 24 hours, even while we sleep. And occasionally an action potential will arrive from its neuron, and that will provide a large potential. That's a postsynaptic potential. I will repeat again. There is a background state of quantum release of neurotransmitter molecules depolarizing this postsynaptic terminal all the time, and intermittently an postsynaptic potential will arrive and depolarize the entire spine head. That is the background state. In that background state, when an incidental lateral activation takes place during the arrival of S1, that's going to trick this postsynaptic terminal to hallucinate that it is receiving activity from its sensory receptors. So we are talking about cellular hallucination. And you might wonder, why cellular hallucination? We are looking for a mechanism that is generating cellular hallucination, because all our higher brain functions such as consciousness, perception and memories, they are all first person virtual inner sensations. So from this biological system we have to search for a mechanism that gives rise to cellular hallucination. Now, looking for a mechanism for cellular hallucination is the key here, and we are not comfortable at this point because here we are crossing a big border, a border that crosses from biological system to something that is completely virtual in nature. We have been successful in doing that in different fields of scientific research. So here we have to go behind that mechanism that generates cellular hallucination in order to understand the inner sensations of all the higher brain functions. The founding director of the MIT's Artificial Intelligence Unit, Dr. Marvin Minsky, in 1980, he published a paper in Cognitive Science, that was volume 4, pages 117 to 124. Name of the paper is K-Line's Theory of Memory. This paper is freely available in the internet. He envisioned that there should be a key location and there should be a key mechanism that should provide virtual hallucinations within the nervous system. So for example, here when S1 arrives, it is inducing a virtual inner sensation of the sensory stimulus S2 arriving from its sensory receptors. It's expected to form as a systems property of systems where if you put extracellular electrodes, there will be an oscillating potential difference between the tips of those electrodes. So in those systems, when the interpostsynaptic functional link is reactivated by the incidental activation of S1, it will generate a cellular hallucination at this interlinked dendritic spine. We have to find out the content of that hallucination, because we need to know in order to find out whether this hallucination is in fact generating the sensory qualia of S2. Now, what is this interlinked spine hallucinating about? It should be hallucinating about the sensory features of S2. Now, how to find out that? We have to extrapolate from this presynaptic terminal towards its sensory receptors. In other words, we have to extrapolate and find out what sensory stimuli can activate the sensory receptors that can finally activate this synapse. So we have to make an extrapolation back towards the sensory receptor level in order to find out the virtual sensory qualia of that S2. So from now onwards, whatever I am going to explain will be virtual in nature. So up to here, everything is real. We can go and measure. We can sense it using our sensory system. A third person experimenter has full access towards what I was talking up to here, but we do not have any access to the cellular hallucination that is being induced at this interlinked spine. So whatever I am going to explain from here in between these two lines will be completely inaccessible to us. We can only build a framework, and we have to go and replicate this mechanism in an engineered system to verify its presence. So in order to examine what is this interlinked spine is hallucinating about, we have to extrapolate back from this dendritic spine and this presynaptic terminal towards its sensory receptors to identify the virtual packets of sensory stimuli that can activate those sensory receptors, which in turn will activate this synapse. That's what this interlinked spine will be hallucinating about. So if you look towards that, this neuron in turn can be activated by a large set of neurons here. We know that nearly 40 to 100 dendritic spine activation out of 10,000 to 30,000 inputs can fire an action potential here. And we also know that firing of a neuron is not input specific. So a large number of combinations of input activation can lead to firing of this neuron. Similarly, if we extrapolate back from that neuronal order towards the lower levels of neuronal orders, we will see that a further large number of inputs can activate that order of neurons. And if we continue that extrapolation, we will finally reach the sensory receptor level. So let this be the sensory receptor level. So the content of the sensory hallucination is that this big set of sensory receptors is receiving some sensory stimuli. Now we have to ask the question whether we need to activate all these sensory receptors in order to activate this synapse. We need not necessarily have to. Maybe a subset of the sensory receptors need only to be activated to activate the synapse. So say for example, let's take this subset of sensory receptors activating this postsynaptic terminal. Now we have to think about a virtual packet of sensory stimuli that can in fact stimulate those sets of sensory receptors, and let that packet of sensory stimuli is called symbion. So that is what this dendritic spine is hallucinating about. It's not just one symbion, it will be a group of symbions that this dendritic spine is hallucinating about. So we can represent this hallucination in this manner here. So this is the postsynaptic terminal, and this is the postsynaptic terminal that it is interlinked to, and this is the interpostsynaptic functional link, and here we can mark a large set of symbions. If you represent the symbions induced at this interlinked spine, we can represent it like this, and during the arrival of S1, this is not only happening at this location, it's happening at large number of locations. So we will have large number of locations that will be reactivated, and we can represent it like this. So these are symbions that are induced here, and the computational product of all these symbions, if you look carefully, we can see that this symbion is an overlapped symbion that is induced by all these interlinked spines. We don't know the computational process at this point. It could be an overlap, it could be an integration. We don't know what exactly what it is. But one thing we can say, there will be a segment of an overlap. So just imagine at this point that it could be an overlap, and that could form the features of S2. That could form the final net content of what this nervous system is hallucinating when the sensory stimulus S1 arrive, when the item is far away from the nervous system. If this continues over a long period of time, how can we increase the efficiency of the system to survive in the environment? If we ask that question, we would say that there are large number of associative learning that is taking place in a background state. Say for example, gravity is there everywhere. So if the nervous system can avoid sensing the common features that are existing within the environment, then that nervous system can focus on to specific sensory stimuli that are either advantageous to that nervous system or deleterious to that nervous system, so that the nervous system can take action towards that, and that will improve the survival of that nervous system in that environment. So in order for that to happen, what should this system develop? We have to ask that question. In order to increase the efficiency of the system, to induce inner sensations that are only beneficial to that system, what should that system do? In fact, the system should avoid all the background stimuli that induce inner sensations that are not beneficial to that nervous system. So how to pack those inner sensations and keep it aside so that the nervous system can make inner sensations specific sensory stimuli that arrive towards it, either those that are advantageous to that nervous system or that are deleterious to that system. In order to think about that, we have to examine the generation of interpostsynaptic functional link little bit further. So for example, these two stimuli interlinked at this point. Let us put it here. So these two are dendritic spines that are stimulated by S1 and S2 respectively. Now during continuous associative learning process, these dendritic spines are going to get interlinked with other dendritic spines in other learning events. This is a reasonable expectation in a nervous system that continuously learns. So now if you look, we can see that the S1 and S2 activated dendritic spines are within this group of interlinked spines. It is reasonable to imagine that if the stimuli from S1 and S2 arrives at the system on a continuous basis, then as I said before, it is advantageous to the system to pack all the inner sensations that are induced by those sensory stimuli into a general matrix towards which the nervous system need not have to pay any attention to, because these are background sensory stimuli induced inner sensations. So in order to do that, it is reasonable to expect that the inner sensations that are being induced at these locations should form a background matrix. So let's imagine that this is the representation of the inner sensations that are induced by the sensory stimuli S1, and let this interlinked spine represent all these interlinked spines that are activated by the sensory stimulus S1. Now similarly, there will be large number of background sensory stimuli that will generate units of inner sensations here. So these are units of inner sensations that are induced by background sensory stimuli. It is reasonable to expect that the net inner sensations that are induced by the background sensory stimuli and the common items in the environment should generate a net large semblance, can be called as C semblance. And we can reasonably expect that these C semblance provide the inner sensations that we call it as consciousness, because the nervous system do not want to pay attention to the inner sensations that are induced by common items in the environment, common stimuli that are arriving from the environment. Say for example, I am not feeling the weight of my leg because that is there all the time. If I sense the weight of my leg all the time, my nervous system won't be able to function efficiently. So that's the background sensory stimuli that's arriving from my legs all the time, and my nervous system has to avoid sensing that. The only way and a favorable way to do that is to incorporate the inner sensations induced by those weight into a common matrix along with the inner sensations induced by other common background sensory stimuli that are coming from the environment that I live in, and generation of such a common matrix of inner sensations will be advantageous to the nervous system, so that the nervous system can now pay attention to specific deleterious and beneficial sensory stimuli, and that can induce clear units of inner sensations that the nervous system can pay attention to. So we have a framework now for generation of the inner sensation of consciousness. Now the nervous system have gone a step further. What if these interlinked spines that represent the background sensory stimuli are reactivated to induce these units of inner sensations all the time? So if it become a default state of the system to reactivate all these interpostsynaptic functional link as a background state, then that system won't be able to sense those backgrounds independently. Now let's go and look at what is going on in the nervous system in a background state. If you look at the cortex, here we have neuronal order 1 and other neuronal orders are seen as layers below it. So here we have 6 neuronal orders in the cortex. Now there are synapses between the neurons that belong to different neuronal orders. Now the neuronal order 6 is connected to thalamus. This is called corticothalamic pathway, and thalamus is in turn giving inputs to neuronal order 2 and neuronal order 3. And so there is a reverberating circuitry that's going on between the cortex and thalamus, and this pathway is called thalamocortical pathway. Thalamus also receives inputs from reticular activating system, and that is a to and fro communication. Thalamus also receives normal background sensory stimulus. We have said that when the nervous system receives background sensory stimuli, it arrives at the thalamus and there is thalamocortical pathways. And now there is a reverberating circuitry between the thalamus and the cortical neurons, and between the thalamus and the reticular activating system. This is continuously going on all the time, and background sensory stimuli is arriving at the thalamus, and that is also contributing to this reverberating circuitry. So during this process, it is advantageous to the nervous system to generate a background net semblance matrix by forming C semblance. At this instance, when we look carefully, we can see that there are large number of these islets of interlinked spines are located between these neuronal orders. So during these reverberations, if these interlinked spines that are coming from stimuli that are commonly present in the environment, then that can generate C semblance, providing an inner sensation of consciousness that will be advantageous to the system. So at this point, it is not known whether the reverberatory circuitry is exactly reactivating those interpostsynaptic functional links that represents the common shared features of the items and events from the environment that are expected to contribute to the C semblance. As I said before, one of the functional attributes of this background semblance is that the nervous system need not have to pay any conscious inner sensation towards individual sensory stimuli that are commonly present in the environment. Now let us go back and examine whether the mechanism of generation of C-semblance for the inner sensation of consciousness can explain all these features that we have seen so far. First person inner sensation. Now we have derived the mechanism of an first person virtual inner sensation, and the computational product of all those units of inner sensations that are generated in a background state is responsible for the inner sensation of consciousness. And then the sensory qualia. Now since the nervous system has a species specific configuration, we can expect certain fixed connections between the neuronal orders in the nervous systems of the members of a species. So we can imagine specific sets of islets of interlinked spines getting reactivated during this reverberating circuitry, and that can generate species specific features. And when the units of inner sensations, when they are getting computed to generate C-semblance, it is expected to give rise to a sensory qualia to that inner sensation of consciousness. Since each individual in a species has had unique experiences which are associative learning events, we expect formation of unique interlinked spines within the nervous system of that individual. And if that becomes a continuous process, then those interlinked spines will become part of large islets within the nervous systems of those individuals, and that will contribute to the C-semblance, and that can explain why individuals have subjective component to the C-semblance. That can explain subjective qualia to consciousness. There is correlations with memory. We have derived the units of inner sensations by the very feature of associative learning. So the ability to induce units of inner sensations of memory is associated with the ability to induce inner sensations of consciousness. So we can explain that. Now, relationship with behavior. We have seen that when the associatively learned stimulus S1 arrives, it can reactivate this interpostsynaptic functional link and activate this interlinked spine, and those potentials can arrive at this neuron, and if this neuron is at a subthreshold activated level at that stage, it can fire an action potential, and that can explain the activation of this motor unit. These can explain why the arrival of sensory stimulus S1 can give rise to a motor action that is associated with the sensory stimulus S2. Now, it is reasonable to assume that all the normal induction of specific inner sensations of memories as well as the associated motor actions is taking place at a background state of C-semblance. That can explain why there is behavior associated with normal level of consciousness. In conditions where the conformation of C-semblance collapses, then the system won't be able to induce inner sensations, and the system won't be able to depolarize this interlinked spine that has to come to this neuron N2 to generate an action potential that will lead to the activation of this motor unit. The ability of the sensory stimulus S1 to induce inner sensation of S2 as well as to generate the behavioral motor activity associated with S2 depends on the background state of C-semblance. So that can explain the normal behaviors of the animal at a background normal conscious state. Now, motor actions at subconscious state. We have seen that the C-semblance is a net semblance that is generated by the shared common physical properties from the items in the environment, and that is being generated automatically by this reverberating circuitry. So along with this common inner sensations that contributes to C semblance, these interlinked spines will also be able to generate the motor actions, and when those motor actions takes place, that is taking place at a background state of consciousness. Since during C semblance we do not sense the inner sensations of those common shared physical properties, it is reasonable to expect that we also do not sense the motor actions, and therefore these motor actions are expected to occur at a subconscious state. When we learn a new associative learned item, and when we induce memories and we generate a motor action towards that, during the initial stages of that newly learned behavior, that motor action is likely to come to the conscious state. But as we repeat that procedure over and over again, the interlinked spines are expected to move towards the center of that islet of interlinked spines, and it will contribute to the C semblance, and the motor action will become subconscious in nature. Now we have to examine the biological features. Consciousness is associated with a particular frequency of oscillating extracellular potentials. How can we explain that? We said that this ability to induce units of inner sensations is a system's property of those systems where the oscillating extracellular potentials have a particular range of frequency. As this frequency gets reduced, then the system property is altered. The system will not be able to induce these units of inner sensations. So we expect this as a first principle, whereby a particular system of neurons that are connected through synapses and where the interlinked spines are generating units of inner sensations, the frequency of oscillating extracellular potential is very crucial for that system's property. Now we have to explain why there is a requirement for sleep during 1/3 of the duration of the function of the system, where consciousness is getting lost. In order for that system to remain conscious during the rest 2/3 of its duration, I have presented it in a separate presentation that you can watch. So in summary, the interlinked spine is continuously being depolarized at its spine head by the caudally released neurotransmitter molecules, and occasionally a postsynaptic potential will arrive to it. So this is the background state. The interlinked spine is always getting depolarized from its presynaptic terminal. In that background state, an incidental lateral activation from this S1 is inducing a cellular hallucination here. So in order to induce cellular hallucination, the background conditions are that this caudally released neurotransmitter molecule induced depolarization should take place all the time. And when we look at here, it is occurring all the time, 24 hours, even while sleeping. So that is already a saturated phase of the system. Now, in order to trick this interlinked spine, this lateral activation should occur only incidentally. That means the incidence of this lateral activation occurring to the system, in order to make this interlinked spine to hallucinate that it is receiving the stimuli from its sensory receptors, requires this incidental lateral activation to be very, very occasional. In other words, the ability to induce inner sensation depend on the ratio of this caudally released neurotransmitter molecule induced depolarization of this interlinked spine to the depolarization that is coming from the lateral side. It is reasonable to think that the ability to induce cellular hallucination can be maximized by minimizing the laterally induced depolarization arriving at this interlinked spine. By looking at the system, we can see that when we sleep, the frequency of oscillating extracellular potentials is reducing. That means S1 will not arrive at this interlinked spine even when the nervous system is exposed to the sensory stimulus S1. Thereby, the system avoids reactivating this interlinked spine, and thereby the system is resetting itself so that the neurotransmitter induced quantarily released depolarization of this interlinked spine is dominating the scenario here, allowing the rest to this interlinked spine, so that the next day morning any reactivation of this interlinked spine can start inducing units of inner sensations here. Evolution might have tried to stop sleeping because the nervous systems will have a disadvantage by remaining unconscious, especially in a predator-prey environment. If you look at the system very carefully, evolution could not avoid sleep because minimizing the arrival of lateral activation can only be achieved by shutting down the system. Evolution would have tried not to sleep, but the system would have failed to continue functioning. So in that regard, we can see the substantive nature of sleep here. So to summarize, in order to trick this interlinked spine to hallucinate, it is essential to minimize this laterally induced depolarization of the spine head. Only in that condition, the system can induce units of inner sensations. So that can explain why the system requires sleep. Now, the effect of anesthetics and encephalitis in inducing loss of consciousness. I have explained the mechanism of anesthetics in a separate presentation. In short, the anesthetic molecules, if they can form interpostsynaptic functional links between large number of dendritic spines which are not otherwise interlinked, that can lead to the formation of large number of non-specific interlinked spines. Now, what is the effect of having large number of interlinked spines? If you look these oscillating potentials, and if you draw it here once again, any oscillation is having two components to it. There is a vector component in this manner and a perpendicular vector component. If you look at the nervous system, the vertical vector component is contributed by the synapses that are located between the neuronal orders, and the interpostsynaptic functional link can contribute to the perpendicular vector component, thereby providing the oscillations. Of course, oscillations are also contributed by the reverberating circuitry and also by some recurrent collaterals. Now the question is, why anesthetics cause reduced frequency of oscillating extracellular potentials? By the formation of large number of non-specific interlinked spines, the anesthetics will increase the horizontal component of the oscillating extracellular potentials. That can explain why the oscillation frequency is reduced, and large number of non-specific interlinked spines will generate large number of non-specific semblances, which will alter the conformation of C semblance, leading to collapse of this C semblance. Thereby there will be loss of consciousness. That can clearly explain how anesthetics can operate. And the effect of encephalitis, there are large number of viruses that release fusion proteins, and interpostsynaptic membrane hemifusion is one of the mechanisms for the generation of interpostsynaptic functional links. Since hemifusion is an intermediate stage of fusion, it is reasonable to expect that viral fusion proteins can generate large number of non-specific interpostsynaptic functional links. And as I explained, the generation of large number of non-specific interpostsynaptic functional links in the case of anesthetics, viral fusion proteins also are going to generate large number of non-specific interpostsynaptic function links that will increase the horizontal vector component, then the frequency of oscillating potentials will reduce. That will change the conformation of C-semblance, and the inner sensation of consciousness will collapse, leading to loss of consciousness. So that provides suitable explanations. Now the question is, why redundancy? Removal of a portion of the cortex is not changing the subjective inner sensation of consciousness or the objective measurements of behavior associated with a conscious state. That indicates that the units of inner sensations that generate the C-semblance, or the subconscious motor activities, or the conscious generation of inner sensations or the motor activities associated with them, does not change. That indicates that there is a surplus amount of units of inner sensations that contribute to C-semblance, and we can afford to remove a portion of them. Still, the conformation of C-semblance remains constant. From that, we can predict that C-semblance has a redundancy feature. We have instances when a subject passes from a fully conscious state to a minimally conscious state to a stupor state and then a comatose state. That indicates that the consciousness is a graded phenomenon and not an all or none phenomenon. In other words, we can remove certain units of inner sensations that can contribute to C-semblance and make that individual minimally conscious. To summarize, we have started examining the inner sensation of consciousness by the very ability of the nervous system to generate inner sensations. We first looked at what happens when the system is very close to the item. There is association between different sensory stimuli from that item. In other words, that is the binding between various sensory stimuli. And we examined a feasible location where such association can take place, so that when the item is far away from the nervous system, the arrival of one of the sensory stimuli can reactivate that change that induced at the time of associative learning to induce units of inner sensation. And we specifically looked at the cellular hallucination. That means the very property of the nervous system to induce virtual first person inner sensation as a system property of those systems that have oscillating extracellular potentials. This is seen as a first principle of the nervous system operations, and we wondered how that nervous system will be operating efficiently in the environment. Then we asked the question that how can the system suppress all the background sensory stimuli induced inner sensations so that it can pay attention to those specific deleterious or beneficial stimuli so that it can survive in that environment. And we figured out a way to do that. That means if the system can generate a reverberating circuitry on its own all the time to reactivate those interpostsynaptic functional links that generate the basic common shared physical property induced inner sensations, then that net semblance can suppress induction of any individual inner sensations to individual sensory stimuli that are commonly present in the environment, and that will give the C-semblance. And in that background matrix C-semblance, the nervous system will be able to pay attention to specific deleterious or beneficial sensory stimulus, and that is essential for the survival of that nervous system in the environment. And we explained all the features of the system based on the mechanism that we hypothesized to generate C-semblance responsible for the inner sensation of consciousness. I sincerely hope that you understood the explanations provided here, and of course we cannot verify this in biological systems. What we can do is to replicate this mechanism in an engineered system to reproduce these features. That's the gold standard that we need to undertake. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me below this presentation or email me. I will be happy to answer them as much as I can. Thank you and have a great day.